What if the textbooks have it backwards? What if Neanderthal traits weren't confined to Europe, but actually stretched deep into China more than 100,000 years ago? That's the provocative possibility raised by recent fossil finds and anatomical analyses. Below is a more deeply researched, restructured take on what the discovery could mean, its context, evidence, and why it might rewrite parts of human evolution. A pair of skulls in China may hold the key to a hidden chapter in human history, one that suggests people with Neanderthal-like brains roamed the North China Plain and intermingled with local archaic populations far earlier and further east than we thought. What if the Western story of Neanderthals is really just one part of a much broader Eurasian story? One in which traits we associate with Neanderthals emerge not just in isolated caves of Europe, but in river valleys and grasslands of Asia, in hybrid forms, long before modern Homo sapiens dominate the scene. To truly appreciate the mystery of the so-called Xuqiang skulls, we need to step back and look at the wider fossil record of Asia. For decades, scientists have been uncovering human remains across China and its neighboring regions that refuse to fit neatly into the familiar boxes of Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Denisovans, or even modern Homo sapiens. Instead, they hint at something far more tangled, a web of overlapping lineages, hybrids, and forgotten experiments in humanity. Take the Harbin skull, often nicknamed Dragon Man, found in northeastern China and dated to over 140,000 years ago. It bears an intriguing blend of primitive features and advanced traits. Some researchers have even argued it represents a new species entirely, Homo longi, a lineage that might have lived alongside us. Then there are the Xuqiang crania, unearthed in central China. Their anatomy reveals striking Neanderthal-like signatures: the shape of the occipital bone, the structure of the inner ear, and the low, flat vault of the skull. These fossils occupy a fascinating middle ground, bridging the gap between earlier Homo erectus populations and the first appearance of modern humans. And at the Halongdong site, dated to roughly 300,000 years ago, we find an even more perplexing picture. Teeth, cranial fragments, and pieces of a femur show a mosaic pattern. Some traits are deeply archaic, robust roots, sturdy bone structure, while others lean toward the modern, like reduced third molars and a more refined facial shape. It's the kind of evidence you'd expect if interbreeding, mixing, and hybrid populations were the norm, not the exception. Put together, these discoveries sketch a portrait of East Asian human evolution that is anything but simple. It was not a straight line. It was not an isolated process. Instead, it was dynamic, fluid, and filled with unexpected turns, reminding us that the story of who we are was written not by a single people, but by many voices echoing across time. The discovery of the so-called Xuqiang skulls, two specimens found in the Yellow River basin of northern China, has opened a new chapter in our understanding of human evolution. Known as Xuqiang 1 and Xuqiang 2, these crania are striking in their blend of features, a mosaic that defies simple classification. The vault of the skull is long and low, its bones thick and heavy. Prominent brow ridges loom over the face. At the back, a pronounced occipital bun juts outward, with a distinct depression above the nuchal lines, a feature anthropologists recognize instantly as classic Neanderthal anatomy. Taken alone, these traits would place the skulls squarely within the Neanderthal lineage. But the story does not stop there. The facial portions retain a different character, reflecting older, more local traits seen in East Asian archaic humans. They do not look fully Neanderthal. Instead, they embody a kind of in-betweenness, a hybrid form that seems to merge the Western archaic template with something distinctively regional. Dating places the fossils in marine isotope, stage 5, between 125,000 and 100,000 years ago. This was not an age of ice and scarcity, but of relative warmth. Monsoons were stronger, deserts less hostile, migration corridors across Central Asia more open. It was a time when different populations could move, encounter each other, and perhaps exchange not only tools and survival strategies but genes. If the interpretation holds true, the Xuchang skulls could represent a population standing at a crossroads. They may have been Neanderthal-like groups expanding eastward, colliding with resident archaic humans, possibly Denisovans, or their close kin. The result? Hybrid populations whose bones bear both signatures, Western and Eastern, fused into a single human story written in bone. Why do the Xuchang skulls matter? Because they strike at the heart of long-held assumptions about where Neanderthals lived and how far their influence reached. For decades, we've been told Neanderthals were largely a European and Western Asian story, confined to caves in Spain, France, or the Levant, with only faint echoes farther east. The idea was simple. East Asia had its own archaic humans, but Neanderthal anatomy belonged to the West. The Xuchang finds force us to reconsider. Here, in the very heart of China, we see cranial features, thick brow ridges, occipital buns, low vaults that look unmistakably Neanderthal. They suggest that Neanderthals, or populations closely related to them, had a much wider presence than textbooks once claimed. Genetics already hinted at this. Studies of living East Asian populations reveal slightly higher levels of Neanderthal DNA than in Europeans. That means contact wasn't fleeting, it was sustained, perhaps repeated. And when we pair this with geological reconstructions of the last 200,000 years, the picture sharpens. During wetter intervals, deserts softened into grasslands, monsoons shifted, and migration corridors opened across Central Asia. Populations that were once divided by vast arid zones suddenly had pathways to meet, mingle, and interbreed. What emerges is a vision of prehistory that is far less provincial. Neanderthals were not simply a Western tale. Their legacy may be written deep into the bones and the genes of people across Asia. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And when it comes to the Xuchang skulls, the debate is only just beginning. To weigh their significance, we have to consider both the strengths of the case and the nagging weaknesses that keep scholars cautious. On the strength side, the clustering of traits is hard to ignore. The back of the skull displays features that are textbook Neanderthal: the occipital bun, the suprainiac depression, the overall shape of the cranial vault. These are not traits that tend to evolve independently in unrelated populations. They point strongly toward shared ancestry. Add to this the environmental backdrop, marine isotope, stage 5, a time of relative warmth and open migration corridors, and the scenario of dispersal and contact feels entirely plausible. The mosaic nature of the fossils is also compelling. They don't suggest a clean replacement of one population by another, but rather a mixing, a blending, exactly what geneticists have long suspected through evidence of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA in living humans. But there are also weaknesses. The most obvious is the absence of DNA or protein evidence. Ancient genetics has transformed paleoanthropology, but in warm East Asian soils, the odds of recovery are slim. Without those molecular fingerprints, we are left with bones alone, and bones can mislead. The comparative sample size is another limitation. We have only a handful of skulls, often fragmentary, each one carrying an outsized weight of interpretation. How representative are they really? Chronology, too, remains fuzzy. Sediments shift, dates vary, margins of error stretch wide, and finally, there is the thorny matter of definition. What do we mean by Neanderthal-like? Are we looking at Neanderthals proper, parallel archaic lineages with convergent traits, or hybrids that blur the categories entirely? The Xuchang skulls, then, sit at the crossroads of possibility and uncertainty. They may yet rewrite the map of Neanderthal history, or they may prove to be something stranger still. So we return to our opening question. If Neanderthal traits appear in the Xuchang skulls discovered in the heart of China during a time when deserts still held water, monsoons reached farther north, and the ancient highways of Asia were open then, perhaps the story of human evolution is not what we once thought. What if Neanderthal-like anatomy traveled farther east than anyone dared imagine? What if these skulls are not outliers, but signposts of a broader hybrid zone that stretched across Eurasia? If the mosaic of features in Xuchang really reflects intermingling, then human history becomes less a tale of clean replacements and more a tapestry threads of lineages weaving, diverging, and rejoining, generation after generation. The implications ripple outward. It reshapes how we understand the spread of humans across Asia. Maybe modern humans did not simply sweep eastward and erase older populations. Maybe many groups already carried Neanderthal-like elements long before our ancestors arrived. It also deepens the larger debate. Did Neanderthals vanish in a sudden collapse, or did they slowly fade into hybrid populations that live on within us? And where do Denisovans fit into this puzzle? Were they silent partners in this story, or active contributors shaping the diversity of East Asia? We must also confront the richness of anatomical variation itself. East Asia, far from being a blank slate awaiting modern humans, may have been a crossroads where multiple lineages met, mingled, and left enduring marks in both bones and genomes. What must happen next to transform speculation into consensus? The first step is clear. Scientists must try to extract ancient proteins or DNA from the Xuchang remains, however unlikely in warm soils. Genetic confirmation would anchor these fossils in the human family tree. At the same time, more discoveries are essential, especially well-preserved skulls, ideally with intact posterior crania, from sites across China and Central Asia. Only then can we test how far these morphological patterns truly extend. Equally important is refining our climate and migration models. We need to know when deserts turned green, when monsoons shifted, and which routes were open for movement across continents. Archaeology must also join the conversation. Stone tool traditions, cut marks, signs of cultural transmission. These traces of daily life could mirror the anatomical signatures and reveal the human connections that bones alone cannot show. In the end, the Xuchang skulls remind us that the story of human evolution is not finished. It is still unfolding, complex, braided, and deeply human. In the bones of Xuchang, we may glimpse more than a skull. We may see a crossroads of human evolution. If the evidence holds, these are not just relics, but keys to rewriting the map between East and West, between archaic and modern, between isolation and mingling. What would it take for you to believe that Neanderthal influence extended this far, this early? What assumptions about human history are you ready to challenge? If you're intrigued by questions like these, stay tuned to Prehistoric Shadows. We'll be following the ongoing excavations, the genetic breakthroughs, the climate models, until the shadows become light.